Thank you very much. Can I have my slides? They are coming. Great. I was sure that my introduction would be scooped, and I was right. Our Vice Chancellor was making the point. But let me give you my reading of the Pope's perspective on our topic. It's what, in my reading, can be condensed in one word, namely the Catholic thinking about charity. I go back to Fratelli Tutti, and I would argue that it's not ambivalent, but it stresses two different perspectives of what this congregation is interested in. We talked a lot about the not only need of, but also the duty to recognize the disabled as an autonomous person. We talked a bit less, but also about the need for assistance. And I would argue that one at least can read the encyclical in a way that integrates both of them. Let me give you a few quotes on recognition. Every human being has the right to live with dignity and to develop integrally, even if they were born with or develop limitations. That's clearly the recognition. Solidarity finds concrete expression in service, and service, in great part, means caring for the vulnerable members of our families, our society, our people. That's the assistance perspective. And I would argue they are coming together in the perspective of the Pope on charity. Charity is always a preferential love shown to those in greatest need. It undergirds everything we do on their behalf. Only a gaze transformed by charity can enable the dignity of others to be recognized, and as a consequence, the poor to be acknowledged and valued in them. So that is the task that the Pope gives us. And what I will try to address in the next minutes is to which degree can we hope that this task will be fulfilled and under which circumstance? Which method am I going to use? A fairly far away method. So all the data I look into doesn't even talk about disability. Still, I think it's able to help us understand the conditions under which both recognition and assistance can be expected. Why would one ever do such an artificial thing as an experiment? An experiment is defined by cutting out as much context as possible. So by design, it's only analogous to what one wants to understand. Or to use the technical term of the industry, it suffers from low external validity. One does so because the main, or as I often say, the only purpose of running an experiment is internal validity. So one hopes to get at causality. We could, of course, do something else. We could look at observational data. And there are lots of interesting objects. I'll list just 3 of them. We could look into disability legislation. We could look into donation rates, or we could look into career choices of persons with a disabled family member. And all of them suffer from obvious risks of confound. If we look into disability legislation, we of course must take into account the party system. The political scientists often call it the unruliness of the political process that can explain what we find. And for those of you who are a bit into data analysis, you also have an obvious problem of ecological inference here, because you only see the fraction of people with disability. We could look into donation rate, but they will arguably also depend on income and wealth. They will depend on the many causes people think they should give for, And they may depend on more mundane things like the tax rate. Same thing for career choices with disabled family members, because we have no chance, if we just look at observational data, to say what those who now are caregivers would have done otherwise if they had not had a disabled member of the family. So what's the big advantage of an experiment? We can randomly select participants from a reasonably well-defined population and randomly assign them to treatment. If under those very, very artificial conditions, we then find a significant difference between the baseline and the treatment, it must have been caused by the treatment manipulation. So that's why one does. Let me now go to the first part of what we would hope for, namely assistance. This is, of course, St. Elizabeth. The first piece of evidence I bring to you is from a meta-study, so a study of multiple, more than 100 other studies that have looked all into the same very, very simple game. And again, simplicity is a virtue here because this allows you to be sure about cause and effect. The extremely simple game is such that you have in the standard version that you have two persons in the lab. One is randomly assigned the active role, the other one is randomly assigned the passive role. The individual in the active role gets some mana from heaven and can do with this mana whatever she or he likes to do. If this individual is maximizing profit, it's obvious what they do, they would keep it. But people are not always and not exclusively maximize profit, and that's what's the whole point of the game. To understand under which conditions somebody would not keep. So if you first look at the left-hand side, you see the modes, or the highest peak is, of course, with those who give nothing. So indeed, people can be selfish. But already on the left-hand side, you see that the second highest mode, so the second peak, is at 0.5. That's people who want to share equally. And then we have a number of people who give somewhere in between and not many who give more. I bring this to you because I want to compare my left-hand part of the panel to the right-hand part of the panel. The difference between these two parts is, on the left-hand side, it's another participant in the lab who is passive. On the right-hand side, it's a charity. And the difference between the two distributions is striking. If the recipient is a charity, the mode, so the highest possible outcome, is giving everything. And if you look at the left-hand side, sure, there's still selfish people, but now the selfish people are no longer the most likely cause, and you have some who share half of it, but they give considerably more. You can push this a little further. That's a much smaller number of experiments, but still everything turns out significant. That's experiments who have manipulated how much money the passive person has. From the passive person has the same amount, that's one on the right-hand side of the picture, has the same amount as the active person, up to the left-hand side, this recipient has nothing. And you see it's a wonderfully clear downward trend. The size of the bubbles is the frequency of the observation. That's what we have in the plot. So the more the others have, or upside down, the less they are deserving, the less they get. The more they are deserving, the more. Interestingly, this even holds if you bring this game to prison. You should think that's the last population where you would expect social preferences. But we gave prisoners two versions of the game. The one is the standard version, where one prisoner was giving to another anonymous prisoner. That's the horizontal line. And thereafter, we were telling them, and here's another pot of money. and now you distribute between yourself and a charity, Brot für die Welt, for those of you who know a little bit the German system, so a very well-known and well-respected charity. And the message from this graph is that were they insensitive towards the recipient, all the bubbles, which again stand for frequency, should be on the 45 degrees. So they should be as willing to give to another prisoner as they are willing to give to a charity. Interestingly, and as we expected, some of the prisoners give more to another prisoner than to a charity. And that's easy to rationalize. They think we are in the same boat, and therefore it's manna from heaven for me, and I should be nice to the other prisoner. But most of the bubbles are above the 45 degree, telling us that even prisoners are sensitive to charitable cause, and if given the opportunity, then they give considerable amount of money. The next thing that we have manipulated was uncertainty about deserving. So that's more to explain than I have time to, but what I want to attract your attention to is the fact that one of the bars is really high, that's the rightmost. And that was a situation where the active person had no clue what the passive person would have. And the higher the uncertainty, that would need more explanation for the details, the higher the uncertainty about the deserving, the more they get. Which I think in our context is a very healthy and welcome message, because most disabled persons are characterized by the fact that you can't simply say they need X, Y, and Z, but that they have to live to a context where it is rather uncertain to which degree they need help. Or another way of interpreting the relevance of this finding for our context is people don't shy away from giving because they don't understand the degree of deservingness. Rather, if they are uncertain about what it means, they are more likely to give, not less. The next thing we did was to give people a chance to ensure their donation. They would say, this is plain crazy. I spent extra money for the fact that my donation is not subverted. And we had three conditions. The left panel is what might be most interesting for this context, namely that you could give for the fact that your donation is not going into the wrong channel, so that those who should get the money are actually not getting your money. And the middle panel is, because I did it together with the tax person, is on countries that subsidize giving for charitable causes, like, for instance, the UK. And there was in our experiment, there was a risk that the tax refund would not materialize, and the right-hand panel combines both of them. What you here see, I don't want to interpret the details in the paper, of course, you find a careful discussion of all of them, but for this context, all that is of interest is that people are quite willing to spend some extra money just to make sure that their good intentions are not subverted by some outside intervention. More interesting and more important even is this graph from the same experiment. The dark black line is how much people give in a context where there is no risk. And they give a considerable amount. And then we have the three dark gray bars. This is which fraction of the endowment they are happy to give if there is one of the three uncertain. And very interesting, and actually I did not expect that, but it's good news for us, that the tax thing doesn't deter, but they are deterred if they think that the money that should go to someone who deserves it actually goes into wrong channels. So that's the too low bar. And now comes the flip side, the light gray bar. They are indistinguishable, statistically speaking, from the condition where there is no uncertainty. So as soon as we give them the possibility to ensure that donation against the risk that something bad can happen, they're giving as much as they would have given without that risk. Again, lesson for the institutional design is either fence the giving off from this risk if you can, but if you can't, give them additional protective possibilities, and then the chances are back that you get the degree of assistance that you hope for. Let me now move on to an even deeper need for assistance. This is when the disability is to a degree that some caregiver must decide on behalf of the person who needs help. This is, of course, the opposite of recognizing autonomy. And if recognizing autonomy is feasible, everybody will want to do that. But we shouldn't close our eyes to the fact that there can be contexts where decisions must be made on behalf of a person with disability. This is actually a growing literature in experimental economics. And let me only show you one result. First, the task that we had. Again, nothing to do with disabilities. It's just about general decision-making on behalf of others. The task is a lottery choice, and you have a 50% chance that you get the good and a 50% chance that you get the bad outcome. And everybody who wants to maximize money would go for maximum risk, because it's always twice as productive if you run the risk than what you can lose. So if you just go for expected value, it's obvious what you would do. But from lots of experimental research and just common sense, we know that most of us are rather risk averse, and therefore the standard choice will be somewhere in this. So that's just to explain to you what we did. And now the one condition that's of interest for what we want to discuss in this context, that is when we gave one person, actually in the household it was, the possibility to decide on behalf of the other. So risk had to be decided, how much risk to take, and taking risk meant you gave someone else a greater possibility to make more money. So it was the trade-off between how much do I care about opportunity seeking or how much do I care about avoiding risk. And we, again, had randomly paired two members of the household, and we had first had them decide individually so that we knew what they individually would do if they had no clue that later on they would be paired with the other household member. And in half of the design, we even told them later on what their counterpart had been deciding in the first part. But it turned out that this was plain superfluous, and family members just know the risk preferences of each other. And then we asked them, now you are, we call it ruler, you are in the position of a ruler. So you have to decide not on your own behalf. You can make no money in that condition, but you have to decide on behalf of how much risk and how much opportunity your other family member is going to have. And in this graph, what you see is that the mode is very clearly at 0, meaning that most people who decide on behalf of others do not do what they would have individually. They do what they expect the person on behalf of whom they decide would have done. So there is a lot of respect for what the other person is doing. But we have also people who are not at this mode, we have a distribution. And this distribution essentially consists of people who impose their own perspective on the other family. And you can also rationalize that. So that's the person in the family who thinks, I know what's good for everyone, and makes the other have what they think is the right. But if that were simply what is behind the result, then the distribution should be symmetrical. So we should, on the left and on the right-hand side, have about the same amount because we just have the same distribution of the preferences in the family. And that's not at all what we find. You see that there is many more choices that diverge from what the family member about which we decide wants into the more cautious and much less that moves into the more risky side, which also tells us an interesting story. Because if someone has to take on responsibility for a family, they are considerably more likely to err on the cautious side than to err on the more adventurous side, which at least makes intuitive sense. So what's the bottom line of those experiments? I think we can end on a line of cautious optimism. Of course, not everybody gets help, and help is not to the full amount. But at least those who have a possibility to give help are sensitive towards the severity of the need, and when in doubt, they do more, and they even are happy to go out of their way. And if decision-making on behalf of a disabled person can't be avoided, then they are sensitive towards their autonomy and would rather err on the cautious side. So my conclusion is, misericordia is real.